fun, man.
When the headlines first started circulating, they sounded like satire. Florida releases thousands of creatures designed to kill snakes. Social media did what social media does best. It turned the story into a punchline. Comment sections filled up with jokes about Florida man solving one invasive species problem by unleashing another, about a state so used to strange news that a swarm of snake-killing organisms barely registered as unusual anymore. People pictured lab-grown mongooses, genetically modified predators, some kind of eco-weapon dreamed up by a wildlife agency with more confidence than sense. The jokes were funny. The problem is that almost none of the assumptions behind them were true. The real story is stranger, quieter, and far more unsettling than anything the punchlines imagined, and it did not begin with a plan. It began with a mistake nobody noticed until it was already too late to undo. To understand what actually happened, you have to start with the snake that caused all of this in the first place, because the so-called snake killers were never the headline. They were a side effect. Burmese pythons are not supposed to be in Florida. They are native to the wetlands and forests of Southeast Asia, where they evolved for millions of years alongside a specific set of predators, prey, and parasites that kept their populations in balance. Somewhere in the exotic pet boom of the 1970s and 1980s, that balance broke. Reptile importers brought pythons into the United States by the thousands, selling hatchlings the size of a shoelace to buyers who had no idea those animals could eventually stretch past 16 feet and outweigh a grown man. Snakes escaped. Snakes were deliberately released once their owners realized what they had gotten themselves into. And in 1992, Hurricane Andrew tore through South Florida with enough force to flatten a python breeding facility near the Everglades, scattering an unknown number of animals directly into one of the most hospitable subtropical wetlands on Earth. The Everglades gave the pythons everything they needed: warm temperatures that rarely dipped low enough to kill them, dense cover, an endless buffet of mammals and birds that had never seen anything like them before and had no defensive instincts to fall back on. Female Burmese pythons can lay up to 100 eggs in a single clutch, and with almost no natural predators large enough to threaten a full-grown adult, the population did not just grow. It exploded. Current estimates from wildlife researchers put the number of pythons living wild in Florida anywhere between 30,000 and 300,000, a range so wide it says less about scientific precision and more about how difficult these animals are to actually find. Studies suggest the average person walking through python habitat spots only a small fraction of the snakes actually present, because their camouflage and stillness make them nearly invisible in the brush. The damage to native wildlife has been catastrophic. Surveys conducted in the deep interior of the Everglades found that populations of raccoons, opossums, bobcats, and marsh rabbits had collapsed by the vast majority in areas where pythons were most established, with some studies describing declines of well over 90% for certain mammal species. Deer, foxes, and even alligators have turned up as prey. One well-documented study released 95 marsh rabbits fitted with radio trackers into python territory specifically to measure predation. And within less than a year, pythons accounted for the overwhelming majority of rabbit deaths recorded. The state responded the only way it knew how: by throwing hunters at the problem. Programs like the Python Action Team and the Python Elimination Program pay contractors to track down and euthanize snakes across South Florida. And the state also runs an annual public hunting competition, the Florida Python Challenge, that draws in hundreds of participants chasing prize money for the most captures. Since these organized efforts began, tens of thousands of pythons have been removed from the wild. And still, by every expert's own admission, it has not been nearly enough. The python population in the Everglades is now considered essentially permanent. Nobody in wildlife management believes eradication is realistically possible anymore. The best anyone can hope for is containment. That is the world the snake-killing creature's story dropped into. A losing fight against an animal that outbreeds every removal effort thrown at it. So when word got out that something in Florida was killing snakes by the thousands, plenty of people assumed it had to be some new weapon in that fight. A secret program. A deliberate release. It made a certain kind of sense, which is exactly why it spread so fast, and exactly why it was wrong. The real story starts not with a government press release, but with a dead snake on a lab table. Back in 2012, a researcher named Melissa Miller, an invasion ecologist working in southern Florida, came across something odd while examining a native snake. Inside its body were parasites that had no business being there, worm-like organisms unlike anything typically found in North American reptiles. Around the same time, a biology professor named Terence Farrell at Stetson University in DeLand was performing a necropsy on a dead pygmy rattlesnake, a small, thick-bodied species native to Florida's pine flatwoods and scrub habitats. What he saw made him pause. Live parasites were emerging from the dead snake's mouth, pale and thread-like, wriggling out as though the body itself was still trying to expel them. Farrell's team said afterward that they had never seen anything like it in a pygmy rattlesnake before. Curious and more than a little unsettled, they tested more of the snakes. The parasites turned up again and again. What Miller, Farrell, and the researchers who followed them eventually pieced together was that these organisms were not new to the planet. They were new to Florida, and more specifically, new to Florida's native snakes. The parasite has a name that sounds almost bureaucratic for something this disruptive, Railietiella orientalis. It belongs to a group of parasites called pentastamids, sometimes nicknamed tongue worms, a genuinely strange branch of the animal kingdom that occupies its own peculiar evolutionary niche, adapted specifically to live inside the respiratory systems of reptiles. This particular species originated in Southeast Asia. Its natural host, the animal it evolved alongside for countless generations, is the Burmese python. That single fact reframes the entire story. This was never a weapon engineered to fight pythons. It was a hitchhiker that arrived inside them. One more unintended consequence of the exotic pet trade, dumping an animal from one side of the planet into an ecosystem that had never had to prepare for it. Pentastamid parasites have a life cycle that depends on more than one host. Adult worms live and reproduce inside the lungs of a reptile, releasing eggs that eventually make their way out through mucus, saliva, or feces. Those eggs get picked up by an intermediate host, often smaller animals like frogs, lizards, or even insects such as roaches, which unknowingly carry developing larval parasites inside their bodies. When a snake eats one of those infected intermediate hosts, the parasite completes its journey, settling into the new host's lungs and starting the cycle over again. For Burmese pythons, an animal that evolved side by side with this exact parasite for an immense span of evolutionary time, an infection is manageable. Their bodies have defenses built up over countless generations of exposure. A python can carry Railietiella orientalis and go on functioning normally, the way an animal with a long evolutionary relationship to a parasite generally can. But Florida's native snake species had no such history. They had never encountered this organism before in their entire evolutionary lineage. There was no inherited immune strategy waiting in reserve, no built-in tolerance shaped by generations of prior exposure. When the parasite jumped hosts, spilling over from invasive pythons into the state's native reptile community, it landed on animals that were, immunologically speaking, defenseless. And the jump did not stay contained to one unlucky pygmy rattlesnake in a lab. Research led by Miller and expanded through years of subsequent fieldwork has confirmed that the parasite has now been documented in at least 19 of Florida's 4 to 6 native snake species, ranging from banded water snakes to black races, a striking cross-section of the state's reptile diversity. A study published in 2023 tracked the parasite spread and found it moving briskly through central and northern Florida, well beyond the southern wetlands where pythons themselves are established, which means the infection is now traveling through native snake populations independent of any direct contact with the pythons that originally introduced it. Researchers involved in tracking the outbreak say it has already been confirmed across dozens of Florida counties, and current projections suggest it is likely to keep expanding into neighboring states across the broader southeastern United States. The scale of that spread is difficult to overstate. This is not an isolated pocket of infected animals near the Everglades. It is a parasite actively moving through the reptile ecosystem of an entire state, carried snake to prey to snake in a chain that nobody is currently able to break. The effects of the infection vary depending on the size and physiology of the snake carrying it. This is where the story turns from strange to genuinely tragic, because the animals hit hardest are Florida's smallest and most vulnerable native species. Dusky pygmy rattlesnakes, for instance, rarely grow longer than about 2 feet. Their lungs are correspondingly tiny, built for an animal that size, not for an animal the size of the 20-foot python the parasite originally called home. When Rhyliotella orientalis establishes itself inside a body that's small, the parasite load that a python's lungs could absorb without much trouble becomes overwhelming, choking off the very organ the snake depends on to breathe. Researchers studying the outbreak have been blunt about the mismatch. The disease is not necessarily lethal to every infected snake, and there does appear to be some variation between species in how well they cope. Florida cottonmouths, for example, carry heavy infection rates yet do not appear to be experiencing the same population declines seen in other species, suggesting some native snakes may have found a way to tolerate the parasite even without a long evolutionary history with it. But for many other species, especially smaller-bodied ones like the pygmy rattlesnake, the parasite has become a genuine driver of population decline, one more pressure stacked on top of habitat loss, road mortality, and the python predation crisis already reshaping the Everglades food web. And there is essentially no practical way to intervene. As one researcher involved in the field put it, you cannot realistically go out and catch every wild snake in an infected region, treat each one individually, and then also treat every frog, lizard, and insect population serving as an intermediate host because the parasite's life cycle runs through the entire local ecosystem, not just through snakes. Even if wildlife agencies had unlimited funding, there is no clean way to extract a single parasite species from a web of interconnected wild animals without essentially trying to sterilize an entire ecosystem. Treating captive snakes one at a time is possible. Treating the wild population is not. Because there is no cure and no realistic method of large-scale treatment, the response that has actually taken shape in Florida is not extermination. It is observation. Researchers established an organization called the Snake Lungworm Alliance and Monitoring, known by the acronym SLAM, built around the idea that understanding the parasite spread requires far more eyes and hands than any single university lab could provide on its own. SLAM has pulled together contributions from more than 100 collaborators, spanning non-profits, academic researchers, state wildlife agencies, and ordinary members of the public who report and submit dead or infected snakes they come across. That kind of distributed, crowdsourced data collection has become essential to mapping how fast and how far the parasite is traveling, because a problem this diffuse, spread across an entire state's reptile population, simply cannot be tracked by a handful of scientists working alone. This is, in its own way, the closest thing Florida has to an active response to this snake-killing creature's story. Not a release, not an engineered biocontrol agent. A monitoring network built to watch an unintended epidemic unfold, one submitted snake carcass at a time, in the hope that understanding the pattern of spread might eventually reveal some way to slow it down or protect the species most at risk. Here is where the story earns its truth will stun you framing. Because the twist is not that Florida did something clever. It is that Florida did nothing on purpose at all, and the thing that actually happened cuts almost exactly opposite to what everyone assumed. People heard thousands of creatures released to kill snakes and pictured a python control triumph, some ingenious biological weapon finally giving native wildlife the upper hand against an invasive predator that regular hunting programs could never fully contain. The truth is closer to the reverse. The organism responsible is not targeting pythons. Pythons are, if anything, the one group of snakes in Florida best equipped to survive it, protected by millions of years of prior exposure that the state's own native species never had the chance to develop. The parasite spreading through Florida right now is not solving the python problem. It is compounding an entirely separate wildlife crisis, one where native snakes, the animals that were already losing ground to invasive predators eating their way through the Everglades food chain, are now also absorbing a wave of disease that traces its origin back to the very same invasive species. It is not a weapon Florida built and deployed. It is a consequence Florida is still trying to fully understand, delivered by an animal nobody wanted here in the first place, doing damage in a direction nobody anticipated. None of this has paused the more visible side of Florida's python war. Removal programs have kept pace, with wildlife officials reporting record-breaking hauls in recent seasons. Groups like the Conservancy of Southwest Florida have removed tens of thousands of pounds of pythons from a relatively small stretch of the Everglades using a method researchers call scout snakes, where captured male pythons are fitted with radio transmitters and released back into the wild during breeding season. Because males instinctively seek out females to mate with, following the signal often leads researchers straight to reproductively active females, the individuals responsible for producing the next generation of hatchlings. It is a clever approach, and it has measurably slowed reproduction in the areas where it has been deployed. State-funded contractor programs and the annual public hunting challenge continue to add to the total, with cumulative removal numbers now well into the tens of thousands of snakes since organized efforts began. But even the researchers running these programs are careful not to overstate their success. The python population across the broader Everglades ecosystem, an area covering thousands of square miles, remains almost entirely intact outside the specific zones where intensive removal has been concentrated. Nobody working on this problem believes the python population is close to being eliminated. The most optimistic assessments describe localized, measurable progress within limited areas, not a turning of the tide across the region as a whole. Meanwhile, the parasite keeps moving through the reptile population largely on its own schedule, invisible to the removal programs entirely, because killing pythons does nothing to remove a parasite that has already jumped into dozens of native species and is now spreading snake to snake without any further involvement from the python population that originally introduced it. Even in a hypothetical future where every python in Florida was somehow eliminated, Raelietiella orientalis would likely continue circulating through the state's native reptiles because it no longer needs its original host to keep spreading. Strip away the viral framing and what is left is a case study in exactly how fragile ecological balance actually is and how little control humans retain once that balance has been disrupted. Nobody designed this outcome. Nobody released anything intentionally. A handful of exotic pet owners in the 1970s and 1980s made decisions that, decades later, are still reshaping an entire state's wildlife in ways nobody could have predicted at the time. A hurricane that had nothing to do with wildlife policy accelerated a crisis simply by knocking down the wrong building at the wrong moment. And a parasite that had spent millions of years quietly living inside one species of snake on the other side of the planet found itself, almost by accident, given the opportunity to spread through an entirely new set of hosts that had never developed any way to resist it. That is the actual story behind the headline that got everyone laughing. Not a triumphant release of snake-killing creatures engineered to solve Florida's python problem, but the slow, ongoing discovery of an unintended biological consequence still working its way through the state's ecosystems, tracked one submitted carcass at a time by a small alliance of scientists and volunteers who are honest enough to admit they cannot stop it, only watch it, document it, and try to understand where it goes next. The pythons are still out there, tens of thousands of them, maybe more, moving through the Everglades largely undisturbed by a parasite that barely troubles them. The native snakes they share the state with are the ones actually paying the price, and the creatures that got so many people laughing were never a solution at all. They were a warning. One Florida is still learning how to read.